Some stories begin like any other. Quiet, ordinary, almost forgettable. And then, in a single night, everything falls apart. A mother, a family that seemed happy, and a case that would divide the entire country for years. But something didn't feel right. Because from the very beginning, this story was never as simple as it seemed. Darlie Routier was a mother living in Texas. She had a husband, 3 young children, and a life that on the surface looked stable. There were no signs of violence, no criminal history, nothing that would make anyone think this family would become the center of something horrific. It looked like any other normal American family at the time. But behind that calm appearance, there were pressures that no one could really see. The family was facing financial difficulties. Expenses were building up. The pressure was quiet but constant. Nothing exploded overnight. There were no clear warning signs. Just small ongoing struggles hidden beneath what seemed like a normal life. And sometimes, it's those quiet pressures that lead to things no one could ever imagine. Everything continued as usual until one night. A night that would change Darlie Routier's life forever and leave behind a question that has never been clearly answered. What happened next shocked everyone. And from that moment on, the story took a completely different turn. Some stories begin like any other. Quiet, ordinary, almost forgettable. And then, in a single night, everything falls apart. A mother, a family that seemed happy, and a case that would divide the entire country for years. But something didn't feel right. Because from the very beginning, this story was never as simple as it seemed. Darlie Routier was a mother living in Texas. She had a husband, 3 young children, and a life that on the surface looked stable. There were no signs of violence, no criminal history, nothing that would make anyone think this family would become the center of something horrific. It looked like any other normal American family at the time. But behind that calm appearance, there were pressures that no one could really see. The family was facing financial difficulties. Expenses were building up. The pressure was quiet but constant. Nothing exploded overnight. There were no clear warning signs. Just small ongoing struggles hidden beneath what seemed like a normal life. And sometimes, it's those quiet pressures that lead to things no one could ever imagine. Everything continued as usual until one night. A night that would change Darlie Routier's life forever and leave behind a question that has never been clearly answered. What happened next shocked everyone. And from that moment on, the story took a completely different turn, and as he ran, he dropped the knife. She claimed she reacted on instinct. She picked up the knife and chased after him. Everything happened fast. There was no time to think. Just a reaction in a dangerous moment. But then, everything stopped. When she came back, she realized what had happened. Her 2 sons had been attacked. And in that same moment, she realized she had been injured too. There was blood, panic, and a reality that could not be undone. That was when she called 911. At the time, her story seemed to explain everything. An intruder, a sudden attack, a mother who survived while trying to fight back. But something didn't feel right. If everything happened the way she described, then why did some details start to not line up? And from that point on, everything began to feel suspicious. At first, Darlie's story seemed clear. A stranger broke in, attacked the family, and then ran. But as police began to examine the scene more closely, things started to change. There was no intruder, no trace, no witnesses, no real sign that anyone else had been there. And from that moment on, the story began to shift in a different direction. The garage where Darlie said the man had run through showed no signs of blood. There was nothing to suggest that someone had just committed a violent attack and then fled in panic. Everything looked almost untouched. That raised a serious question. If there had been a brutal attack, if someone had been injured and bleeding, then why was there no trace along the path where the attacker supposedly used to escape? Then, there was the window. Part of the screen in the garage had been cut as if someone had created an entry point. But when investigators looked closer, they noticed something important. There was no real evidence that anyone had actually gone through it. No clear signs of forced entry. No disturbance that would match someone climbing in or out. It looked less like a natural point of entry, and more like something that had been staged. And then Darlie's story began to be re-examined. Every detail, every timeline, every action she described. At first, it seemed reasonable. But when placed next to the physical evidence, some parts no longer matched. But something didn't feel right. Because if there was no intruder, then the entire story would have to be explained in a completely different way. And from that point on, everything started to feel suspicious. As the investigation continued, the details at the scene were examined more closely. And those details made the story far more complicated. The weapon was identified as a knife, but it wasn't brought in from outside. It was a knife from inside the home, a small detail, but one that began to shake the entire idea of an intruder. If the attacker was a stranger, why would he use a knife from inside the house? Then another piece of evidence appeared. A bloody sock was found about 75 meters away from the home. It contained the blood of both children, and immediately it created two completely different possibilities. On one hand, it could be a trace left behind by an intruder while escaping. But on the other, it could also be something placed there on purpose. But something didn't feel right. If someone inside the house had been seriously injured, then why weren't there more clear blood traces leading outside? At the same time, Darlie's injuries became a point of focus. The cuts on her neck and arm were not considered severe, and that raised more questions. If this had been a sudden and violent attack, why weren't the injuries to the surviving victim more serious? And from that moment, the direction of suspicion began to shift. But the story didn't end there. Inside the house, investigators also found an unknown fingerprint. A detail that could change everything if it truly belonged to someone outside the family. But the problem was, it couldn't be clearly identified. No one knew who it belonged to, and it couldn't be directly connected to the crime. Each piece of evidence on its own could be explained in different ways. But when everything was put together, something started to feel off. And from that point on, the case was no longer just about what happened. It became a much bigger question. Who was really behind? It was everything that took place inside that house that night. By that point, the case was already complicated. But then one detail appeared, and it almost completely changed how people saw Darlie Routier. It wasn't physical evidence. It wasn't something found at the scene. It was a video. The video was recorded at the cemetery where the two boys were buried. In it, Darlie is there with her family. They are celebrating a birthday for her child who had passed away. There are balloons, there is cake, there is singing. And in the footage that was shown, Darlie is smiling. She takes part in the moment as if it's a kind of memorial celebration. But somehow, that made everything feel heavier. When the video was broadcast across the media, public reaction changed almost immediately. People started asking questions. A mother who had just lost 2 children. How could she smile? How could she take part in something like that? Suspicion didn't come from the crime scene this time. It came from her behavior, from her emotions. But the story wasn't one-sided. Darlie's family spoke out. They said the video did not show the full picture. They claimed there had been a serious emotional memorial before that moment. But it wasn't aired. What the public saw was only a small part taken out of context. But something didn't feel right. In a case where every detail is examined, was that moment proof of something cold? Or just something misunderstood? And from that point on, the case was no longer just about what happened that night. It became about how people judge grief. What happened next would take everything even further. In the end, everything led to one place: the courtroom. This was no longer just a story about one night. It was no longer about theories or speculation. This was where every detail, every piece of evidence, every word would be weighed. And it was here that 2 completely different versions of the same story collided head-on. The prosecution presented a clear narrative. According to them, there was no intruder. They argued that Darlie had inflicted her own injuries to make herself look like a victim. They claimed the crime scene had been staged. And more importantly, they pointed to a motive: financial pressure, a reason they believed could explain something almost unimaginable. But what made their argument even more powerful in the eyes of the public wasn't physical evidence. It was the cemetery video. They used it to portray Darlie as cold detached, someone capable of doing something like this. But the defense saw the case very differently. They emphasized that there was no clear motive, no witnesses, no confession, no direct evidence proving that Darlie committed the crime. They questioned the bloody sock found outside. If everything had been staged, then where did that come from? And more importantly, they focused on timing. They argued there simply wasn't enough time for one person to commit the attack, injure herself, stage the scene, and then call 911. All within such a short window. 2 sides, 2 stories, 2 completely different explanations. But something didn't feel right. How could the same set of evidence lead to 2 opposite conclusions? And as the jury listened to everything, the question was no longer what happened, but which version of the truth they believed. In the end, after all the arguments, the conflicting narratives, and the controversy, the jury reached its decision. In 1997, Darlie Routier was found guilty of murdering her son, Damon. It was a verdict that didn't just close the trial. It changed her life forever. She was sentenced to death by lethal injection. And from that moment on, the case entered a different phase. It was no longer about investigation, no longer about debate. It became about waiting. But something didn't feel right. Even though she was convicted for the death of one child, Darlie was never tried separately for the death of the other. That left the full picture incomplete. One part of the story had been decided, but the other part remained unresolved. And because of that, even after the verdict, even after the trial ended, there was still a sense that the story wasn't truly finished. Something was still missing. And what happened next would continue to raise more questions. But the verdict didn't end the controversy. If anything, it kept the case alive for years. Darlie continued to file appeals, trying to challenge what had been decided in the courtroom. But many of those appeals were denied. Legally, it seemed like the door was slowly closing. But in the public eye, the story was far from over. As time passed and technology improved, new DNA testing began to take place. It brought hope that some of the old evidence could be re-examined with greater accuracy. In a case where almost every detail had been questioned, DNA was seen as something that could finally bring clear answers. But in the end, no final conclusion emerged. Everything remained uncertain, not enough to silence the doubts, but not enough to overturn the verdict either. And maybe what makes this case so haunting is the fact that even those closest to her never fully turned away. Darlie's ex-husband still believes she is innocent. Through everything that has happened through a death sentence and years of controversy, that belief has remained. But something didn't feel right. If everything had truly been settled, why does this case continue to be discussed, re-examined, and debated? And from that point on, the story was no longer just about the verdict. It became about a deeper question. Was the truth ever fully uncovered? And after everything, this story still doesn't feel finished. There is a verdict. There is a conclusion from the court. But the case of Darlie Routier remains one of the most debated. Because at its core, there are two completely opposing possibilities. One side believes Darlie is the killer, that what happened that night was not a break-in, but something staged. The details at the scene, the evidence, and even her behavior afterward. All of it can be connected to form a story that makes sense in that direction. But the other side sees it differently. They believe there may have been a real intruder, that the inconsistencies in the case are not proof of guilt, but signs of an incomplete investigation, that there are still pieces of the story that haven't been fully explained. And it's this conflict that makes the case so different, not just because of what happened, but because of what has never been fully answered. But something didn't feel right. If the truth was truly clear, why is this case still being debated after all these years? Maybe the most disturbing part isn't the verdict, but the question that remains. Is this the story of a mother who did the unthinkable, or a mistake in the investigation that led to an irreversible outcome? And if you had been in that courtroom that day, what would you believe? And in the end, maybe what makes this case so haunting isn't what we know, but what we still don't. A mother was convicted, with evidence that convinced many the truth was clear. But at the same time, there are details that don't fully line up questions that have never been definitively answered. Two perspectives, two versions of the truth, but only one verdict. And maybe the most unsettling part is this. If one of those versions is wrong, then the cost is enormous. Either a mother did something unimaginable, or a mistake in the investigation led an innocent person to a death sentence. But something didn't feel right. If you had been the one making that decision back then, what would you have believed? Do you think Darlie Routier was truly guilty? Or was there an intruder who was never found? And if you want to explore more cases where the truth lives in that same fragile space, you might want to watch the next story right here.